The wooden mop handle had never felt like a weapon. Until now. Danika's palms had long since gone numb, the grain of the wood pressing deep into the creases of her hands, her knuckles standing out like pale ridges against her dark skin. A thin line of blood traced a slow path from her left forearm where a blade had kissed her, the only wound she'd let them give her. The only one that showed. The others, the ones carved into her across 30 years of grinding, invisible, expendable survival, those didn't bleed anymore. They just burned. And right now, that burn was the only thing keeping her upright. She had snapped the mop head clean off when the first one rushed her. Now the jagged, splintered end jutted forward like a lance, and she held it the way a woman holds the last thing standing between the world and something she refuses to let them take. Behind her, two small bodies pressed into the back of her legs like they were trying to disappear into her. Talon's fingers had bunched the fabric of her soul cleaner's uniform into a tight fist at her hip. His sister Sari hadn't made a sound since the screaming stopped. Not a single sound, and somehow, that silence was more devastating than any cry could have been. 4 men. Black clothes. Faces masked. The kind of stillness that came not from hesitation, but from recalculation. They had expected an obstacle. Not a wall. The one in front, broader than the others, the kind of stillness around him that told you he gave the orders, tilted his head. His eyes, cold and measuring above the mask, moved from the stick to her face. Then he gestured. A small, almost casual flick of his wrist. Walk away. This was never your business. Danika's breath came in slow, deliberate pulls. The alley around them was a narrow canyon of crumbling brick and hanging laundry, Korean signage bright against the gray sky. Somewhere behind the men, the nanny lay still. Danika hadn't let herself look a second time. She shifted her weight. The worn soles of her work boots found the uneven asphalt like they'd always known this ground. She had spent 6 years in this city being invisible. 6 years scrubbing floors at 4 in the morning, folding herself small in crowded subway cars, swallowing every instinct that might make someone remember her face. She had built a life out of disappearing, because the last time she had made herself matter to someone, the last time she had let herself be seen, she had lost everything. She was not supposed to be here. She was not supposed to care. And yet here she was. Feet planted. Jaw set. A broken mop handle pointed at 4 armed men because 2 children were pressed against her legs and she could feel them shaking. She would not move. They didn't know what she knew. They didn't know what it cost a person to unlearn survival. They didn't know that the most dangerous version of a human being was not the one with nothing left to lose, it was the one who had found something worth losing again. They would learn. The man with the cold eyes took a step forward. Danika's grip tightened. Somewhere at the far end of the alley, an engine cut. Then another. Doors opened. And from the shadows at her back came the sound of footsteps, not fleeing, not frantic, but deliberate, and many. The 4 men went very still. They didn't know it yet, standing in that narrow canyon of brick and laundry and consequence. But this moment, this woman in a blue cleaning uniform, bleeding and unbroken, standing between 2 terrified children and the worst the city had to offer, this was a stone dropped into the deepest, darkest water. The ripples were already moving. They would reach every corner of Seoul's underworld. They would carry her name into rooms she had never been invited to enter. They would give her enemies she hadn't earned yet, and allies she hadn't imagined. They would strip away the invisible life she had so carefully constructed and replace it with something she had stopped believing she deserved. A purpose. A place. A family that would be forged in exactly this kind of fire. But that was still coming. Right now, there was only the alley. The children at her back. The cold eyes in front of her. And Danika Rhodes, cleaner, survivor, and the most dangerous kind of woman, refusing, with every fiber of 30 years of hard living, to move. If you walked away right now, you'd never find out how a cleaning woman with a broken mop handle became the most feared person in Seoul's underworld. You'd never find out what she lost that made her impossible to break. And honestly, that would be your loss. Not mine. I'll still be here, telling stories about the people the world forgot to count, the ones who turned their grief into armor and their invisibility into power. Subscribe. Right now. Because this woman is just getting started, and you have no idea what's coming for her. Or what's coming for the men who underestimated her. 12 hours earlier. The work was not hard. That was the thing nobody understood about cleaning. It wasn't the labor that ground you down. It was the invisibility. You learned, quickly, to move through spaces like weather, present, functional, unremarkable. You learned not to make eye contact with the people who worked in the offices you scrubbed. You learned not to read the names on the desk plaques or the messages on the whiteboards or the birthday cards left out in the open. You learned that other people's lives were not yours to want. Danica had learned all of it. She had been a diligent student. She had one rule she broke only once, and only alone, in the hours before the city woke up. She let herself remember Amara. Not for long. Never for long. Just enough to hold the shape of her, 5 years old and made entirely of light, with Danica's forehead and her father's laugh and absolutely nobody's patience. A child who had loved loudly and inconveniently and without the slightest interest in moderating herself for the comfort of rooms she walked into. She did not let herself think about Amara after 9 a.m. It was a rule. By 6:30, she was on her third building, a glass and steel office tower in Gangnam, the kind of place that employed people like Danica to make it gleam before the people who actually mattered arrived. She moved through the lobbies and corridors with the practiced efficiency of someone who had made herself functionally invisible, her cart a familiar extension of her body, the sound of her work blending into the ambient hum of the building systems. She was finishing the fourth-floor corridor when she saw them for the first time. 2 children. 7, maybe 8 years old, a boy and a girl. They were standing in the corridor outside a suite of offices, school backpacks dwarfing their small frames, hers pink, his black, and they were arguing in rapid Korean with the polished, unself-conscious intensity of siblings who had never once needed to perform for anyone. The girl was winning. Whatever the argument was, she had already won it. The boy knew it too. His arms were crossed in exactly the way of someone who was still talking because admitting defeat out loud was beneath him. Danica paused her cart. She didn't mean to. It was the laugh that did it, the girl's laugh, sudden and delighted at something her brother had said, even in the middle of arguing with him. A sound so purely, uncalculatedly alive that it hit Danica somewhere in the locked-off part of her chest like a fist. She moved on before either child noticed her. Rule 7, don't let the little things get to you. She told herself she hadn't broken it. She was almost sure. She did not know, as she pushed her cart toward the elevator and rode it back down to the lobby, that the man stepping out of the black car at the curb below was watching the building's entrance with the quiet vigilance of someone accustomed to threats. She did not know that the 2 children upstairs were his singular vulnerability in an empire built on the premise that he had none. She did not know that in 12 hours, in a narrow alley 4 blocks from where she was standing, those 2 children's lives would be in her hands. She would not have wanted to know. It would not have changed what she did. She had come to Seoul the way people come to places they have no connection to, deliberately. She had wanted a city that didn't know her name, didn't know her face, and had absolutely no reason to ask about either. Seoul had obliged. It was enormous and indifferent, and it swallowed her whole without ceremony, and for a long time that had felt like mercy. She broke one rule only, and only once, and only alone, in the pre-dawn quiet, she let herself remember Amara. Not for long. Never for long. Just enough to hold the shape of her, 5 years old and made entirely of light, with Danika's forehead and her father's laugh and absolutely nobody's patience. She had been dead for 6 years, 3 months, and 11 days. The drunk driver had not survived the crash either. Danika had never decided how she felt about that. She had decided, in the months that followed, that she would not survive it either, not in any way that mattered. She would keep moving. She would keep working. She would make herself so small and so necessary and so forgettable that the grief would eventually lose her in the crowd. It had almost worked. She pushed her cart into the elevator and pressed the button for the 4th floor and watched the doors close on her own reflection, a woman in a blue uniform with tired eyes and excellent posture, and told herself, as she did every morning, that this was enough. She almost believed it. She told herself it was enough. She almost believed it. How many of us are living in that almost? How many of us have built lives around surviving instead of living, because the last time we let ourselves want something, we lost it? I don't ask that to hurt you. I ask it because this channel exists for exactly that feeling. For the people in the almost. Subscribe. Leave a comment right now, just the word almost, if you don't want to say more. I see you. We see each other here. The men who feared Min Jun Han rarely said his name out loud. This was not superstition. It was the kind of practical caution that develops in people who have watched what happens to those who are careless with it. Names were invitations. Min Jun Han was not the kind of man you invited into a conversation without being certain you were ready for the consequences. He was 41 years old and looked it in the way that iron looks its age, not worn down, but denser for the years. He wore his suits the way other men wore armor, with the quiet understanding that appearance was its own form of violence. He spoke rarely in rooms full of people, and when he did, the rooms went still in the way of things that have learned to pay attention. He had built the Han Syndicate over 15 years from a minor debt collection outfit in Mapo into the most quietly powerful criminal organization in the city. Not the loudest. Not the most visible. Min Jun had no interest in spectacle. Spectacle was for men who needed to convince others they were dangerous. Min Jun had never needed to convince anyone of anything. The facts made their own argument. He controlled 6 districts. He owned 3 legitimate real estate companies, a logistics firm, and a private security consultancy that employed a remarkable number of former special operations soldiers. He had never been indicted. He had been investigated 4 times. All 4 times, the investigations had concluded quietly and without explanation, and the investigators had moved on to other things with the particular haste of men who have been made to understand something important about their own futures. He was, by any measurable standard, untouchable. He knew exactly one thing that could undo him. They were 7 years old. They argued about everything. They shared a birthday and absolutely nothing else in terms of temperament, Tailin careful and watchful and given to long silences, Sari fast-talking and luminous and constitutionally incapable of leaving a room the way she found it. They had their mother's eyes. Their mother had been gone for 4 years, taken by an illness that had not cared in the slightest about who their father was, and Min Jun had never fully forgiven the universe for demonstrating that there were things beyond the reach of his particular kind of power. He kept them close. He kept them safe. He had people on them at all hours, drivers, a nanny, men in plain clothes at a discreet distance. He had engineered their lives with the same meticulous precision he brought to everything else. He had not engineered for Corbin Fox. He had not engineered for a Tuesday afternoon, a quiet alley, and a woman in a blue cleaning uniform who had no reason whatsoever to do what she was about to do. He was still in a board meeting when his phone rang. The look on his face when he answered it was one his associates had never seen before, and would never forget. Corbin Fox had a theory about power, and the theory was this: every fortress has a door. You didn't have to be stronger than the walls. You didn't have to outlast the siege or outspend the garrison or win a war you were never equipped to fight. You just had to find the door, the one unguarded, unexamined, human thing that the man inside had forgotten to protect because he loved it too much to see it clearly. Corbin had been looking for Minjun Han's door for 2 years. He found it on a Tuesday, in a school pickup queue in Mapo, watching a nanny shepherd 2 small children into a private car with the relaxed confidence of someone who had never once considered that routine was its own kind of exposure. He sat in a rented vehicle across the street with the window down and a coffee going cold in the cup holder, and he watched, and he counted the seconds between the children's exit from the school gate and the car door closing behind them, and he smiled for the first time in recent memory. 11 seconds. Every day, 11 seconds. That was Minjun Han's door. He brought it to Rafe and Jalen the following evening, in the back room of a convenience store in Yangdungpo that functioned, on its surface, as a convenience store. Rafe Molina had been with Corbin long enough to have the good sense to listen before reacting. He was compact and precise and had the flat, appraising eyes of a man who calculated angles for a living. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and then he said, "The nanny's the problem." Corbin agreed. The nanny was the problem. Jalen Price, who was younger than both of them and compensated for it with an excess of certainty, said it wasn't a problem at all and looked at Rafe when he said it. Rafe looked at the table. Corbin looked at Jalen for a long moment, the way you look at something useful that requires careful handling, and said, "We don't make problems we don't have to make." Jalen said nothing after that. The plan was not complicated, because Corbin had learned that complicated plans were for men who didn't trust their own execution. It was a Tuesday operation, school day, regular route, the alley shortcut the nanny used when she was running behind, which she was, reliably, on Tuesdays. Block both ends. Move fast. The children would be in a secondary vehicle and out of the district inside 4 minutes. The message to Minjun Han would go out an hour later. The terms were simple: his territory west of the river, transferred cleanly, and his children would be home by dinner. Corbin did not anticipate complications. He had accounted for the nanny. He had accounted for the cars, the timing, the exits. He had not accounted for the woman in the blue uniform, pushing her cart out of the service exit at the alley's midpoint, who stopped walking and did not run. Nobody ever accounted for her. That, it turned out, was the mistake. Mrs. Yoon was 7 minutes behind, and 7 minutes, on a Tuesday, was the difference between everything. She had been the Han twins' nanny for 3 years and in that time had developed the particular brand of competence that comes from managing 2 children who are individually a great deal and together a force of nature. She was 62 years old, stout, unflappable, and possessed of the unshakable conviction that she could handle whatever the afternoon produced. She had, on various occasions, handled a broken collarbone, allergic reaction to street food, and the times Sari had decided to negotiate her own terms for returning home from a classmate's birthday party. Mrs. Yoon had handled all of it. She had not handled being late, not once, in 3 years. Today she was late because the school had held a brief assembly that ran long, and then Taylin had lost one glove and they had spent 4 minutes locating it in the lining of his own jacket, and now she was standing at the mouth of the main street watching the traffic back up ahead of a delivery truck and doing the arithmetic of Tuesday in her head. The alley shortcut would save her 8 minutes. She had used it twice before, in winter, when the cold made the long way unconscionable. It was quiet. It was direct. The car would meet them at the other end. She took it. Taylin noticed the black car first. It was parked sideways across the alley's far mouth in a way that was not how cars parked, and he stopped walking and said, quietly, "Mrs. Yoon." She had already seen it. She turned, and the second car was behind them, and the men were getting out, and Mrs. Yoon had time to do only one thing before the nearest one reached her. She pushed the children behind her back and she screamed. It was a good scream. Loud, full-throated, the kind that carries. It bounced off the brick walls and the hanging laundry and the corrugated metal of the service doors and went up into the flat Tuesday sky, and then one of the men, not roughly, but with a finality that left no room for argument, removed her from the equation, and the alley went quiet again. The children did not run. Sari had her arms around her brother, and her brother had gone absolutely still in the way he did when he was frightened, that terrible tail-in stillness, like an animal that has decided motionlessness might save it. It was into this silence that a service door 30 feet away opened with a metallic complaint, and a wheeled cleaning cart rolled out into the alley, pushed by a woman in a blue soul cleaner's uniform who was pulling her earbuds out and squinting at her phone, calculating, by all appearances, exactly how long it would take her to reach the bus stop. She looked up. The cart stopped. For a moment, just a moment, nobody moved. The men, the children, and the woman with the mop stood in the alley's afternoon light, and the only sound was the distant complaint of the traffic on the main road, and the thin, barely audible sound of Sari Han beginning to cry. Danica Rhodes put her phone in her pocket. She looked at the children. She looked at the men. She reached back and took hold of the mop. She had a rule. She had built her entire life in this city around it. Not your business. Not your people. Not your pain to carry. It was not a cruel rule. She had not made it out of indifference. She had made it the way you make a tourniquet, not because you want to, but because the bleeding had to stop somewhere, and this was the only pressure she knew how to apply. 6 years of practicing it had worn the edges smooth. It had become less a rule and more a reflex, the way flinching becomes a reflex, the way bracing becomes a reflex, the way all the small armors of survival eventually stop feeling like choices and start feeling like skin. She had applied it on the subway platform when the old man dropped his groceries and nobody stopped. She had applied it in the stairwell of the Gangnam building when she heard raised voices behind a closed door. She had applied it, over and over, in 100 small moments that did not belong to her, until the application of it had become as automatic and as painless as breathing. She told herself it was painless. She was already reaching for the mop when Sari screamed. Not the crying from before, that had been quiet, private, the kind of sound a child makes when they are frightened and trying not to be. This was different. This was the sound of a child who had stopped trying to hold anything together. It came out of Sari Han like something tearing, high and raw and absolutely without self-consciousness, and it hit Danica in the chest like a physical thing, like a hand reaching through the years and grabbing her by the sternum, and for one suspended moment she was not in a Seoul alleyway at the end of a Tuesday shift. She was in a hospital corridor. She was 34 years old. She was hearing a sound she had never let herself hear again because the last time she had, it had been coming from her own throat. The moment passed. The alley snapped back into focus. One of the men, Rafe, though she didn't know his name yet, had tailed in by the backpack straps, pulling him toward the far car with the brisk efficiency of someone completing a task. The boy was not screaming. He was doing that terrible stillness again, his feet dragging on the asphalt, his face a mask of something too old for a 7-year-old to be wearing. Sari was fighting. Small fists, zero technique, absolute fury, she was scratching and kicking at the second man's forearms with everything she had and getting nowhere, and the sound coming out of her was constant and searing, and it was doing something to the inside of Danica's chest that she had not given it permission to do. The rule surfaced one last time. Automatic. Practiced. Worn smooth. Not your business. She looked at the boy's face. The terrible stillness. The resignation in it. The rule dissolved. She snapped the mop head against the alley wall, felt the wood crack clean, and walked forward. She had not been in a fight since she was 19 years old. The body, it turned out, did not forget. She came in fast and low and without announcement, and the first thing she did was not strike, it was position. She put herself between Taylin and the man holding him, and she planted her feet, and the shift of weight that followed was not something she had thought about or planned. It was older than thought. It lived in the muscle and the bone, in the part of her that had grown up in places where standing your ground was not a philosophy but a necessity, and it came back to her now with the easy, terrible fluency of a language she had never quite stopped speaking. Rafe saw her and made the mistake of hesitating. She hit him across the forearm with the broken handle, not a warning, a removal. The crack of wood on bone was loud in the narrow alley and his grip on Taylon's backpack failed and the boy stumbled sideways and Danica was already moving, using the follow-through of the first strike to bring the handle back around in a tight arc that caught Rafe at the side of the knee. He went down on one side and she stepped past him toward the children without looking back, because looking back was a luxury and she didn't have it. Jalen came at her from the left. He was faster than Rafe and younger, and he had the particular aggression of someone who had never been genuinely stopped before. He got a hand on her shoulder and spun her and she let him, because the spin gave her momentum she didn't have to generate herself, and she came out of it with the handle driving upward into his solar plexus with everything her body weight had to offer. The sound he made was not a word. He folded. She caught him by the collar on the way down, more instinct than intention, and redirected his descent into the alley wall, and then she stepped back and put herself in front of both children and faced the remaining men and tried to remember how to breathe. Her arm was bleeding. She hadn't felt it happen. A blade, somewhere in the scramble, shallow, she thought, though her hands were shaking too much to be certain. The pain arrived belatedly, the way pain does when the body has been too busy to process it, a bright insistent heat along her forearm that she filed away and did not look at. Two men still standing. Corbin Fox and one other, both motionless now, recalibrating. Sari had stopped screaming. She had both arms around her brother and her face pressed into the back of Danica's uniform and she was very still, and that stillness, so different from Talon's defeated stillness earlier, this one fierce and trusting and chosen, did something to Danica's chest that she could not afford to examine right now. She raised the handle. She waited. Behind her, she could feel two small heartbeats against her spine, fast and alive and entirely hers to protect, and she understood, with a clarity that had no business existing in the middle of a fight, that she had already lost the thread of the life she had so carefully constructed. She found she did not mind. Corbin Fox had miscalculated once in his life before this. The first time had cost him 2 fingers on his left hand and 18 months in a facility outside Incheon, and he had spent every one of those months understanding precisely where the error had been made and swearing it would not happen again. He was not a man who repeated mistakes. It was, arguably, his single most admirable quality. He was making one now and he knew it, and knowing it did not stop him. He pulled the gun because he had nothing left. Rafe was down. Jalen was down. His fourth man had backed against the far car and stopped being useful sometime around the moment the woman had redirected Jalen into a brick wall with her bare hands and an expression of focused, exhausted calm that had unnerved even Corbin, who was not easily unnerved. The plan had not accounted for her. The plan was gone. What remained was the arithmetic of a man who had run out of options and was reaching for the last one. He raised the weapon and pointed it at her and said, very quietly, "Last chance." Danica did not move. She was breathing hard, her forearm bleeding freely now, her legs carrying the particular trembling weight of a body that has given everything and is running on something below the threshold of reserve. The handle was still in her hands. The children were still behind her. She looked at the gun and then she looked at the man holding it and something in her face, not defiance, not bravado, something older and quieter and more absolute than either, told Corbin Fox that she was not going to move. He had 1 second to decide what that meant. He didn't get to use it. The sound arrived before the men did, engines, multiple, cutting hard into both ends of the alley simultaneously, and then doors, and then footsteps that were nothing like the footsteps of men who were uncertain about what they were walking into. They came in fast and they came in organized and they filled the alley's narrow canyon the way water fills a space, completely, finding every gap, leaving nowhere to go. Minjun Han walked through them. He did not run. He covered the ground between himself and his children at a pace that was somehow more frightening than running, the absolute controlled urgency of a man whose outer surface had not cracked but whose eyes were doing something that the men around him had never seen before and would discuss in low voices for years afterward. His enforcers had already reached Corbin. Corbin's gun had already found its way to the ground. These were the kinds of efficiencies that Minjun's people were very good at. He stopped in front of his children. Taylin looked up at him with the careful face of a boy who had decided not to cry until he was certain it was over. Sari had already decided it was over, and was proving it comprehensively, both arms around her father's waist, face buried in his jacket, the sound she made low and exhausted and deeply, finally, safe. Minjun held them for a long moment with his eyes closed. Then he opened them, and he looked at the woman standing between where his children had been and where the threat had come from, bleeding and upright and still holding a broken mop handle, and his expression did something complicated and private that settled, after a moment, into a stillness that on Minjun Han passed for profound. He said nothing yet. Neither did she. Some understandings do not require an opening sentence. They took her to a hospital first. She didn't argue. One of Minjun's men, not a doctor, but clearly someone who had dealt with wounds in the field and did not find them interesting, cleaned and dressed her forearm with a brisk competence that suggested this was not an unusual Tuesday for him. Danica sat on the edge of an examination table and let him work and said nothing, because she was very tired and because the particular silence of aftermath, the stunned quiet that settles over a body once the emergency has finished with it, had claimed her entirely. Sari fell asleep in a chair across the room with her jacket pulled over her like a blanket. Taylin sat beside his sister and watched Danica with the careful, measuring attention of a child who had decided she was worth understanding. Minjun Han stood at the window with his back to the room, and Danica understood, without being told, that he was not looking at anything outside it. He spoke first, when the medic was done and the room had settled. He did not look at her when he began. He said, I have employed 41 people in a personal security capacity over the course of my career. Most of them came with credentials. References. Training records from institutions I could verify. He paused. Every single one of them, he said, was protecting a job. He turned from the window. You were protecting my children, he said. There is no credential for that. Danica said nothing. She had learned, over 6 years of cleaning offices, that silence in response to a powerful man was almost always the correct choice, because powerful men generally had more to say and preferred to say it. He did. He told her what the position would entail: close protection for both children, full-time, live-in, with access to resources and personnel that she would not find anywhere else in the city. He told her the number. He said it without emphasis, the way people say numbers they have long since stopped finding large. She absorbed it with the same flat effect, which seemed to satisfy something in him. Then he said the thing that mattered. He said, my children do not trust easily. Taylin has not willingly touched a person outside this family in 14 months. He looked at his son, who was still watching Danica from the chair with those old, careful eyes. He looked back at her. He trusted you in that alley, Minjun said. Before you had done anything to earn it. That is not nothing. That is, in my experience, almost everything. Danica looked at the boy. The boy looked back at her without blinking, and in his face she saw, not Amara, she would not let herself see Amara, she had rules, but something adjacent to Amara. Something that required protecting not out of obligation but out of the particular ache of recognition. She looked back at Minjun Han. She said, I'll need different boots. These ones are finished. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Close enough. He said, I'll have someone handle it. She said 4 words after everything. After the alley and the blood and the gun and the children pressed against her spine like she was the last solid thing in a crumbling world, that's what she said. And if that line didn't break something open in you, I don't know what will. Subscribe before we go into the final chapter. Because what's coming next isn't action. It's something quieter and more devastating than anything that happened in that alley. It's a woman deciding to live again. Don't you dare miss it. The suit was charcoal gray and it fit her like an argument she had already won. She stood in front of the mirror in the room that was hers now, not rented, not temporary, not the size of a generous thought, and looked at herself for longer than she usually allowed. The soul cleaner's badge was gone. The steel-toe boots were gone, replaced by something low-heeled and serious that a quiet man named Mr. Kong had delivered in a box without comment, along with 4 more suits and the understanding that her previous footwear had been, as promised, handled. She had folded the blue uniform and set it on the shelf above the wardrobe rather than throwing it away, and she had not examined the reasons for that closely enough to name them. Some things you keep. Not to go back. Just to remember what the ground felt like before you learned you could stand on higher. 3 weeks had passed since the alley. Corbin Fox was not a problem anymore. This had been communicated to her not through any explicit statement but through the particular quality of silence that surrounded his name when it was not spoken, the kind of silence that in Minjun Han's world functioned as a full sentence. Rafe and Jalen had made separate and apparently permanent arrangements to be elsewhere. The 4 men who had blocked the alley's ends had been handled with the same quiet efficiency that Minjun's organization brought to everything it considered administrative. Danica had not asked for details. She had not needed them. What she had needed, it turned out, was considerably simpler and considerably harder to come by than safety or salary or a room that was hers. She had needed, and she was still getting used to admitting this, even only to herself, even only in the privacy of the mirror, to matter to someone again. To have her presence be the specific thing standing between people she loved and the worst the world had for them. To be necessary not as a function, not as a service, not as a body that cleaned what other people dirted, but as herself. Irreplaceable. Known. She heard them before she saw them. Sari first, she always heard Sari first, the running footsteps and the commentary that preceded her everywhere like a herald, and then the quieter footfall of her brother, who had taken to walking close to Danica's rooms in the mornings in a way that he had not yet acknowledged and she had not yet remarked upon, because some things between people developed better without being named too soon. The door opened without a knock. Sari took in the suit with the frank, total assessment of a 7-year-old who had not yet learned to moderate her opinions. You look different, Sari announced. Danica looked at her in the mirror. Behind Sari, Telin had appeared in the doorway, and he was looking at Danica with those careful, ancient eyes, and the corner of his mouth had done something small and private and devastating. Good different, Telin said. He said it like it wasn't a big thing. It was the biggest thing. Danica turned from the mirror and straightened her jacket and said, breakfast. Both of you. Now. She walked out of the room and they fell in beside her, 1 on each side, and the 3 of them moved down the corridor together, and the alarm would never find her already awake again, not like before, not out of grief and habit and the dull obligation of surviving, but it didn't matter. She was already home.